recording. Okay, so what we came here today for was this part of the presentation. And I titled it the SDS, or not SDSU, sorry, the estate planning COPS, with COPS being the COPS component. Basically, this is part of the estate planning that farmers and ranchers can do on their own, and some of the things that we can help them get moving with, in a manner that when they walk in and they're just starstruck, there's like so many things that they can do. They've been to 15 different training education sessions and they've talked to different attorneys and they're stuck. They're basically just spinning in the water because they don't know what they want to do, and not sure how to implement all of those things that they could be doing. So my big starting spot for a lot of the producers that I work with, and probably that you guys have worked with, is to let them know they already have a plan in place, whether it's something that they've deliberately done, or if they have done absolutely nothing, there's a plan in place based on all the other things that they've put together already, one way or the other. They might have some type of contracts out there, life insurance policies and the like. They have ownership in place already. So there's our C and our O, as you can see. If they've titled a piece of property or they've titled their car, put names on bank accounts and those types of things. And then probate is there as that last component. And so here's my COPS. They've already got all these things in place. And then I walk through with them on talking about what those components are. And that really gets into that more communication that they can be doing within their families. You can get a feel for where there might be some of those problem issues that might come up, especially when we start talking about who the beneficiaries are going to be of these contracts. If they've got a life insurance policy, retirement accounts, who's on checking accounts, and those types of things. If fair and equal is something that you need to be talking about with the producer, that really comes into play at this point, because you can open up that door and say, okay, on your life insurance policy, I see that you're missing 3 kids because they weren't born yet when the policy was purchased. And maybe we need to be doing some updating there. Or we can look at it and say, on your life insurance policy, I see that you're giving equally to all of your children, as well as you want the operation to continue. So how does that play out? And start those communication and those question asking components as we start moving through with some of these things that they already have in place, or something that they might need to be changing. And it goes all the way clear down into the checking accounts. Is that contract, and when they put the kid on as a signer, did it really get added as a signer, or did they become an owner of that checking account? So giving them that ownership of their own estate plan and having them start looking at some of these contracts and things that they already have in place really becomes something that they can move forward with and be proactive with. And sometimes, power is what they're really looking for, and they can take back that power looking at some of these contracts and things that they can change and do on their own. We really want to think about some of those components. We had our life insurance conversation a couple of months ago through our IFTN training on it's a tool that we can use to purchase the farm, depending on who owns the life insurance policy, who the beneficiaries are that way, or maybe it's a component that we can look at different ways to provide some type of benefit to our children that aren't on the farm. We're able to provide an inheritance without breaking up the farm, without breaking up the assets in that manner. So we want to be thinking about, who's buying the insurance policy, who's the beneficiaries are, and those types of things, so that we can make some of those distributions in the most beneficial way to accomplish our goals. And as we're talking with the farmers and ranchers at their table, these are some of those questions that we can, glean from our conversations so that we can make sure that the plans that are put in place when they go to you as the attorney, or they stop by your office as the insurance agent, or the financial planner, we know what their goals are to ensure that everything's getting covered the way it needs to be covered. We also need to be thinking about those non-farm assets and non-farm heirs and that distribution, because maybe that's something that we can do to maybe not make it 100% equal, but make it equitable and change some of the language that we're talking about with our families to that equitable component instead of equal. And then the last bullet there says, what changes are needed? What do we need to be looking forward? And that's a huge factor as well. One of the changes that I think I need on this slide, even though that's a cute set of kids sitting there on that gate, does it make anybody else cringe seeing that they're standing at the wrong end of the gate? They're not on the hinges. Makes me cringe a little bit, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. So the next part of the COPS component of estate planning is that ownership component, and how do they have things titled? So that's the next step in the transition of those assets. One of the different attorneys that I talked to that came into some of our conversations said, well, let's just title things so that everything's titled, and at the death of the older generation, we just automatically transition that to our farming heir, or to the heir that we want to receive, whether it's that really cool little Mustang in the picture, or if it's the farm, it's just there. We set it up and we can make that happen. Those of you that have legal degrees and working with farmers and ranchers, and those of you that have been in this business a long time probably cringed when I said that out loud. And I know a lot of my bigger estate planning attorneys around me were like, yeah, that's probably not one of the best ways that we want to look at that, just due to the liability situation that, if Junior has some type of car accident or gets sued for something or has a financial problem, if their name's on the title, that means they are the owner at this time. And as the owner, that is part of their balance sheet and their assets. So we can look at that as part of the litigation and the lawsuits there. So I'm not an attorney. I don't try to pretend to be one. I just try to do some of that looking and devil's advocating to say, what happens if? And those are some of the questions that have been brought up that you might want to bring up to your clientele as you're working with them there. So one of the research studies that I've done, this was done in 2016. So I did a survey of farmers and ranchers and their heirs, and I broke those heirs into on-farm heirs versus off-farm heirs. And I asked them, as we're thinking about how assets are transferred, I asked them to rate their level of agreement or disagreement on different statements that I put out to them. And you can see that my numbers aren't maybe as high as what I wanted or whatever I was looking for, but we kind of get an idea of what they're thinking and feeling related to each of these statements. So this first statement that I have here listed says, the next generation cannot afford to purchase the land from me. And if we look at the landowner generation there, we can see that almost 80% of the landowner generation said they agreed with that statement to some level. Either completely agree, or slightly agree responses, all included in that big green bar there. So we can see that the landowner generation is trying to figure out if we're passing this on to that next farming heir, we've got to do something different than making them pay for it at full value. The on-farm heirs, they were also in agreement at about 60%, and the off-farm heirs had some disagreement with that. They're not in that full agreement category, with all the responses being less than 50% there. So we can see that there's some communication components that we might need to come up with when we're talking about fair and equal and equitable, and how we're making these asset distributions for their inheritance as we go forward. Another question that I asked or a statement that I asked them to respond to was the statement that I, being the landowner generation, I need to retain ownership of the major assets to provide an income source that covers my living expenses. The landowner generation, about 80+% of those said, yeah, I need to maintain some type of involvement and ownership of these assets so that I can take care of my medical bills, pay food and housing and all of those types of things. The on-farm heirs were like, yes, definitely. Mom and dad need incomes from this land. Whereas the off-farm heirs were pretty much in a variety of disagree, neutral, or agreement with that statement. So we can see further communication so that we can avoid problems and situations down the road really needs to start happening, because we've got that wide variety of responses from the off-farm heirs regarding how mom and dad are going to live. Okay. So I told you that, I try not to be an attorney at any of these meetings, that I really try not to get into the weeds too hard when I'm talking to farmers, ranchers on titling. So just clicking through some of the common ways to title property and some of their pros and cons, I just kind of let them read through what they are, so that if they see something as they're working through their titles and going through to make some of these changes, they know what they are. They know what some of the advantage and disadvantages maybe to them are, and they can start looking for some of those red flags as they move forward. The spot that we kind of stop and have a little bigger conversation and try to get into more of that estate planning and farm transition components is when we talk about entities holding the ownership of the property and the assets, whether that's an S Corp or a C Corp, depending on if that's good or bad for them, moving into an LLP or the LLC, some type of formal partnership. Maybe we move it into different type of trust for either revocable or irrevocable trusts. And again, those all come down to the goals of the family operation, what's all involved in the operation, and how we can best put those together. The thing that a lot of the producers that I work with up here, taking your name off of an asset is sometimes hard to do, even if it's the Heather Gessner Trust, but now the trust owns it instead of me owning it. Sometimes that becomes one of the issues that people have with their operations. So talking them through those needs and those desires and getting a feel for that is that next step in what a coordinator can do as you sit across the table and be like, okay, so why do we not want to do this? Is it because it's been in your name for 50 years and before that it was in grandpa's name for 80 years? Those types of things are important, and some of the things that are embedded in that farm ownership and what we really take home with us. So if we can start with those conversations on saying, here's some other ways that we can hold title. They all do different things. And by the way, they come with their own set of rules that help you accomplish some of the goals that you have in mind. It says who can own what different pieces of ground, how that ownership's transferred. So if you want to make sure that, so-and-so in-law never has access to it if there's some type of divorce or a death in the wrong order within your family, we can make sure that that ownership is always maintained by the relationship, that you have with your heirs and those types of things. We can also write in there how we're going to terminate this business. So maybe you don't rule from the grave forever and ever and ever and ever at all times. But at such a point, if the heirs 2 or 3 generations down decide that the business needs to be terminated, here's how we can make that happen. It also lets them look at it and say, maybe me and my son or my daughter, we don't get along anymore, or we can't work together at this point. Um, and maybe there's different reasons, health related reasons that somebody is not as active in the operation as they thought they were once going to be. So we can put those termination clauses in there to protect all of the variety of who knows what might come down the hill as we move forward with that estate plan and that transition plan of working together. When we're talking about entities as owners of those farm estates, talking about that transition of management and ownership gets to be some of the sticky spots, especially management when you've got a 20, 30-year-old coming in to the operation. They've got new ideas, they've got different ways that they want to try to get things done. Maybe they're not looking to work as many hours or as long as hours as mom and dad have, or grandma and grandpa, but the operation has changed as well. So is that time commitment and the way we've always been doing things, does that need to be done in the same manner anymore? So working with clientele and having those conversations about how are we going to make this happen really becomes an important component to for those different family members, and putting timelines to it. And that's where, sitting down with coordinators, we can start putting in some of these plans that say, mom and dad are starting to retire out of the active day-to-day operations, by the time they're 62. And at 65, they've really come back to help out during the heavy lifting times of the year, planting season or harvest season, brandings or those types of things. And by 70, we put that date time on there that says all the bookkeeping and all the management that way has been turned over to the next generation. Because sometimes those are the aspects that get missed in the transition plan, is changing over who has control of the finances, and at what point can we say we're going to make some changes here as that next generation, even if mom and dad are kind of like, I don't know about that for sure. So having that all written down and discussed while you're sitting at the table with them really becomes that next component. And I'm sure you've all had different stories that you can share about family members that were never going to let go of those reins versus some of those that are like, he came back from college, he's now in charge, and they turned the whole thing over to the 23-year-old just all at once. So it all comes down to the goals of the operation and how they're communicating and how they're planning on working together. And as coordinators, trying to put all those pieces together, that's kind of some of our job as we move forward that way. We can also sit down and talk to them about different leases. In the last couple of slides, we saw that mom and dad need to have ownership of that ground so that they can maintain their livelihoods. So maybe that's where the land lease comes into place, or maybe equipment leases. We can look at buy-sell agreements, so that might be one method of transitioning to the next generation, so that we're taking over ownership as the younger generation and providing income for mom and dad or grandma and grandpa on the farm. Yet other things that we can be looking at that way, if we put it into an entity, either an LLP or something like that, what type of wage and compensation do we have coming up, and how are we going to make sure that everyone is covered? That becomes one of those bigger discussions then on, is our operation big enough to support the families that are coming back into the operation? So, maybe as a single person coming back to the farm, we didn't need as much compensation, but as we have more family members and involved, we might need to be changing and making some adjustments to that as we move forward. And then the insurance component also comes forward on who's paying insurance. Are we paying life insurance? How about the liability components that are related to the operation and all of the things that we might have going on? That all comes down into some of those entities owning ground and being the operators of the operation. So making sure we have those conversations when we're sitting there helps us put together really good estate plans with our clientele and gets them talking about where they're at and where they want to go. Another of those statements that I asked during this survey was related to land ownership and the use of some of those other entities. So the full statement was land ownership should be transferred into a new entity, and I gave them a trust, an LLC, or etc., in order to accomplish my goals. And you can see there was a pretty big variety of responses, again, from the landowner generation to the on-farm heirs to the off-farm heirs. The on-farm or the landowner generation, about 60% of those individuals thought that maybe this would be something that we can look at to accomplish our goals. The on-farm heirs, 100% of those responses said that that was something that they were really considering in order to accomplish the goals of the landowner generation there. The off-farm heirs flipped the coin on us, with over half of them disagreeing with that statement and the other remaining percentage agreeing at some point. So they were either yes or no to that conversation. So if we do put ground or any of the other assets into an entity, again, the communication components to explain to that non-farm generation on why we're doing these things and what the reason is and how that's going to benefit everyone in the long term really needs to happen. So as we get down to the P part of the probate of our COPS component, this is the final method for transitioning assets, proceeding before a judge, and everything is finalized. I really kind of look out at the crowd at this point when I've done these in presentations, and I'm like, this pretty much occurs in two different instances. If you die with a will or if you die without a will. And they're kind of give them a minute and they're like, pretty much all the time then is what you're saying. And yeah, that's the long and short of what I'm saying, unless everything's in a trust or something like that. But pretty much we go through probate to finalize all those components. And when we talk about dying without a will, I'm sure your states have that codified law that has the plan in place for them as well, if there isn't a will. When we talk about assets being liquidated to determine value so that we can distribute them equally and distribute cash to the heirs, that really becomes an eye-opener for farmers and ranchers. Probably doesn't accomplish their goals as they move forward. And it's kind of that kickstart so that they put some things together. Then we just hit with the distribution through a will, saying anything that's left after we went through the contract side, after we went through all of the ownership components, anything that hasn't been transferred at that point can be distributed via the will. So, a lot of our non-titled assets and those types of things, personal property to specific people, making a list of items that we have, some sentimental value to us or to the children or the grandchildren that we want to give them to, that really comes out in the will then, and how we divide those types of items out. So being an extension, I try never to just leave people with a whole bunch of information. So what are we going to do here? If you're giving all this stuff, what's that step-by-step process that we need to do as we go forward? And for those of you that are certified coordinators, if you scan on that QR code, you should be able to go to the survey link to report your participation at this point. If you're watching it live, if you're watching the recording, the link probably won't be working anymore. But step by step for working with my farm families, first thing we do is look at those contracts, gather every insurance policy we have, any retirement accounts from jobs that maybe we don't hold anymore, and any other accounts that might list a beneficiary, whether it's military, job service components, anything that go forward. We really want to make sure that we have those accurately filled out, especially if there's been divorces or remarriages, additional children born, or if somebody has passed away. Are they still on those contracts, and will our assets go the direction that we want them to? So we can really help them move forward and make some of those big changes. And by making the changes and bringing it to light that we have some errors and we need to be looking at different things. When we talk about the ownership components, again, we're talking about all those titled assets. How do we have assets titled? Are we using the word and, or are we using the word or when we're saying who owns different pieces of property or ownership of checking accounts or savings accounts? So everything that's involved needs to be looked at. Around here in South Dakota, we've got silage trucks that maybe are used for 2 weeks out of the year if we're doing a little bit of custom work, otherwise maybe 2 days out of the year, depending on the operation. But that's a titled asset. So we need to dig the title out for that 1942 truck that has holes in the floorboard, and you skip third gear because there really isn't a third gear anymore. It still has a title. We still need to make sure it's titled appropriately and in our name or in the name of the business so that it transfers the way that we need it to. Then work with them to figure out which way that needs to be titled and how do we get them the titles changed if we need to. Regarding the probate component, find the will or create one might be the next big steps. And that's where we really get into some of those bigger components that way, with the probate or with the estate planning components, is making some of those changes or getting started depending on the age of our family member that we're working with. You can usually kickstart people into doing something when you put out one of those oh my goodness stories in front of them. So I've worked with a family and had them participate in some of my education conferences, and they came back and they shared that they sat all their children down, 5 children at the dinner table, and said, okay, here's a copy of our will. This is what our estate plan looks like, and this is how things are going to be distributed. Of the 5 children, child number 1 says, I make a motion, we accept this estate plan as presented and adjourn this meeting. Child number 2 says, I second that motion. Child number 3 was like, wait a minute, I think we need to have a whole lot more conversation on this thing. The reason being, the will was put together when child number 1 and child number 2 were the only ones that were born. And they were listed in the will as receiving all of mom and dad's assets at their death. Okay, so child number 1 named, child number 2 named, 3, 4, and 5 not mentioned. Child number 3 was the one that was farming with them and had been for 40 years and was bringing back his oldest son at that time. So he was hoping that they could do some changes, updates, and making sure that everything was done a little more accurately. So now recall that child number 1 and child number 2, they were mostly kidding. They were very supportive of their brother taking over the operation and those types of things. But kids being kids, they had to get a little bit of a rub in there. So when we're working through the rest of the story with our families, if there's personal property items that they want to be included, making a list of those types of things, including the story that goes with them on why that item is important or special, is really that some of those next steps. And then helping them secure that scheduled attorney appointment. I know I vet a lot of attorneys in South Dakota on, their experience with farm and ranch estates and what they've done for estate plans and those types of things. So if you've got a list of those attorneys in your pocket that you can help share with them, or those of you that are estate planning attorneys, making sure that they've got that next appointment scheduled is really important. So then what do we do? Inventorying our operation. And when we sit down and talk about inventories, I'm talking about a whole lot more than just what the assets are. What's the human capital side of the operation, and who's here to help our operation grow? What potential challenges and challenging personalities might we need to overcome as we move forward with that estate plan? So really doing that deeper dive into what's all going to be involved and what your goals are. Evaluation of, did we find all of the assets and all the titles? What types of things do we need to be making additions to, changes to, so that when we get into that next step of planning and we're writing down our goals and we're writing down who's all involved in our family and who all's involved in the operation, we can then find all the right professionals. And, as a coordinator, that's one of our next steps, is helping them find the right people, helping them work through the creation of that plan so that it can be developed in the legal components all included that we need to have included. And then the last little bullet there says you need to implement it. Putting together your estate plan and having the big set of documents on board is the first step, and that's a really good step to get done. But then as we go forward, we need to make sure that the next piece of machinery that we purchase has the right title on it, making sure that when we buy a new excuse me, if we set up a different life insurance policy or a long-term care policy, that we've got the proper beneficiaries listed and the proper information included on that. So making sure that we're doing all of those things really becomes important, as well as going back through then after a couple of years and evaluating if the plan's still in place the way we need the plan to be put into place. So with that, here's my contact information. If you want to start talking through, how I run through with some of my family meetings and those types of things, or if you've got different tips or ideas. And again, the QR code is included there so that you can click on for your CEU credits if you're so inclined or need them for today's session. So with that,